Hey guys, in this video, we're going to be starting to look at obsessive compulsive disorder and as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. We'll be watching some videos and other things in class and having conversations around this information, but I wanted to provide you with just the basics here, and then we can talk more about it in class. So, obsessive compulsive disorder, often abbreviated OCD, is it was formerly characterized as an anxiety disorder, which I think will make sense in a second. But over time, it's actually been branched off and is considered its own type of disorder. One of the things that we'll see is that obsessive compulsive disorder also includes things that are now included as their own disorders, like hoarding, skin picking, hair pulling, those kinds of things that fall under the umbrella of obsessive compulsive disorders. So the main type or the main characteristic of obsessive compulsive disorder is that there is a persistent unwanted thought that keeps coming back, right? These are our obsessions, right? These are things that you can't stop thinking about. And then compulsions are some sort of ritual or some sort of behavior that you do that either causes distress or alleviates the anxiety related to the obsession. So we'll talk a lot about people that have obsessive compulsive disorder. One of the biggest things that they obsess about are dirt or germs, some toxins, right? Something bad. So a lot of times the rituals involved, right? If you're preoccupied with germs, then you're probably going to do things like wash your hands a lot. And when I say a lot, I mean like multiple times in a row. To the point of real damaging your hands and other things. You can look at other obsessions with things like symmetry, order, right? And there are some famous examples of people who, if things are out of order a little bit, that triggers their OCD, and that leads them to focus more about it. I should say that at this point, that when we talk about symmetry and order, a lot of people like to use OCD kind of casually, right? So you might hear someone say like, "Oh, it's really bothering me that those shades are uneven in the classroom," or that this is the pictures aren't level, right? One's a little bit higher than the other, or crooked, and that triggers my OCD. We should be careful with that, right? So obsessive compulsive disorder is a mental disorder, right? It is something that causes severe dysfunction and distress among people that have it. So using that phrase kind of casually is probably not the best use of the term. Remember, we talked about this with phobias, right? That it's kind of like the next level. It's not just being afraid of something, it's that this causes severe, panic attacks or anxiety related behaviors. So obsessive compulsive disorder, we should treat the same way, right? So we shouldn't just throw around OCD casually when we say like, "Oh, I don't like that that's a little messy," or that bothers me a little bit. We need to be careful not to do that, right? Because it kind of diminishes the seriousness of the disorder. So it's really important to keep track that the unwanted thoughts are the obsessions and the behaviors are the ritual or the compulsions, right? Which is where we get obsessive compulsive disorder. Oftentimes, the obsessions can be so haunting that the quality of life is severely impaired, right? And compulsions so time consuming. There are people who can't leave their house because they have to keep checking the lock again and again and again and again and again and again and again, and that prevents them from, maybe they're running late or something happens and they have to start over. I'll be sharing some stories, some more, details here, and with videos and stuff. We'll take a look at this together, but I just wanted to provide some of the basic types of obsessions and compulsions as well. So I'll read. You see me looking down. I have the DSM in front of me, open to obsessive compulsive disorder. So OCD needs to have both obsessions. You can either have obsessions, compulsions, or both. Obsessions, recurrent, persistent thoughts, urges, or images that are experienced that are intrusive and unwanted, that cause marked anxiety or distress, or despite the attempt to ignore or suppress such thoughts, they engage in some sort of compulsion. Compulsions are repetitive behaviors, hand washing, ordering, checking, mental acts, when the individual feels driven to perform them, The behaviors are aimed at preventing or reducing anxiety. There's also these things can be time consuming, right? Can take up more than an hour each day engaging in these rituals and thoughts. Um, it has to be not related to any sort of substance or medical condition, and it has to just basically be not a result of other disorders, right? Depression or other anxiety issues. One of the most famous people in history to have obsessive compulsive disorder was Howard Hughes. If you've ever seen the movie The Aviator, with Leo DiCaprio. He plays Howard Hughes. It's kind of like a biopic of his life. Um, there are a number of famous people that have it as well. Famously, Howie Mandel has it, and we'll watch a video where he talks pretty openly about obsessive compulsive disorder. So, a little graphic here just to kind of help keep our the words, kind of straight in our heads. Obsessions are the things that you're thinking about, and compulsions are the actions. Okay, so when we talk about obsessive compulsive disorder, right, it's the thoughts that trigger some sort of compulsion. Let's move to PTSD, right? So PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. It's changed its name over the years. There's a really good classic George Carlin bit where he talks about the use of language and how, in World War I, this condition was widely referred to as shell shock. Then it became battle fatigue. Then it became operational exhaustion, and now it's post-traumatic stress disorder. So he kind of talks about like euphemisms and how, shell shock is much more, it feels like you're there, right? Whereas post-traumatic stress disorder is kind of an umbrella thing. Now, granted, post-traumatic stress has grown, right, rightly so, to include things that are not, war-related or battle-related. Although the majority of people that do have post-traumatic stress are soldiers. So post-traumatic stress is 4 or more weeks of the following: haunting memories, nightmares, social withdrawal, jumpy anxiety, sleep problems. It is the constant. When I say haunting memories, I mean that you cannot forget them. You're constantly reliving the traumatic event or the moments right before or right after the traumatic event. Oftentimes it leads to social withdrawal, right? Because the memories are so intrusive, and then the anxiety levels are so high that you basically are not sleeping and all these other things. The more frequent and severe the trauma, the more adverse the outcomes, right? So the more traumatic experience or repeated experience with traumatic events can increase the likelihood of post-traumatic stress and can also worsen it, right? It can actually, compound. So the more traumatic events you've experienced, the higher your likelihood is of developing post-traumatic stress. But also, the more times you engage in traumatic activity, the higher the worse the post-traumatic stress could be. And we see post-traumatic stress with mostly, like I said, veterans, sexual assault survivors. But it can be anything. Post-traumatic stress can happen after a car accident, even if no one was really even injured, right? The trauma, right, in the traumatic event is up to the individual, right? So what might be traumatizing to one person might not even bother anyone else, or someone else. I shouldn't say anyone else, someone else. So, right, it's up to each individual and their own body's responses to events that can lead it to be trauma or not. When this was studied by the CDC after Vietnam, people who were exposed to combat were twice the risk of alcohol abuse and anxiety. 15% of Vietnam veterans reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. If they were non-combatant, right, if they weren't involved in any combat, they were just kind of in the military, support systems or whatever, that gets halved. Notice that that's still, right, 7 or 8% of, the millions and millions of people that fought in World War or in Vietnam, right, that they're dealing with post-traumatic stress. And if we talk about heavy combat, people who experience heavy combat, that's almost half, right? Almost half of the soldiers in Vietnam who saw heavy combat develop post-traumatic stress disorder. That is a lot, right? That is a very high number. And it certainly makes us think about, the way we treat our veterans and the support system at the VA and all these other things, and how important it is that people who are being set in harm's way for the good of the country, right, that they have access to the healthcare that they need. When we talk about men versus women, we talk about in terms of people who've experienced real trauma, and by real trauma, the what most people will consider traumatic events, against sexual assault, war experience, any sort of violence. We're seeing relatively low numbers, right? So 10% of women, 20% of men develop post-traumatic stress. That's relatively low, but also really high, right, in terms of traumatic events and post-traumatic stress related symptoms. Some it's a little bit, right. It's the memories, it's the nightmares. You kind of close your circle in. For other people, it's severely debilitating, right? Can't leave the house, can't really engage in normal life because of the post-traumatic stress. Now, what's interesting, kind of the flip side, if we were looking at this from like a humanistic perspective, right? Um, Almost all major religions have some sort of way to deal with trauma, right? That what we would call post-traumatic growth, and that is a way to use the trauma as a way to springboard into some sort of betterment of yourself and society. You see this a lot with the image that comes to my mind are gun violence victims, or their parents or their family members who then use their grief as a way to enact public policies for gun safety regulations, or more recently, right, George Floyd's family using their traumatic experience of having their father, son, brother die, using that into trying to advocate for police brutality reform and systems that allow for more oversight, right? So taking the trauma and turning that into something positive, right? So we understand that trauma unfortunately happens, right? And it's just how we understand it and frame it that can help us understand post-traumatic stress a little bit. Let's talk about anxiety disorders in general. And this is including obsessive compulsive disorder and post-traumatic stress. So when we look at genetic influences, we see that there is some heritability of anxiety disorders. We know from twin studies that identical twins reared apart, if one has an anxiety disorder, the other one is very likely to have one as well. We don't have specific genes, right? Just kind of like everything else. There's not like there's one gene that turns on anxiety disorders or turns off. But we know that with epigenetic processes and the way that the environment impacts our genetic makeup, right? These things can be, triggered, right, on or off, depending on the environment, right? So you might be predisposed to an anxiety disorder, but if nothing really triggers that in your life, then you won't ever develop one. We know, like, go back to, we're going to do a little review here, right? So the learning perspectives, right? So the behaviorists look at anxiety as classical conditioning, right? So if you have an anxiety issue, right, a learning or behaviorist, psychologist will maybe try to help desensitize you to those fears. And we'll actually talk about that as in terms of a therapy technique, which done correctly actually works really well. What I say by reinforcement maintains anxiety, right? So think about the situation where you have someone who has anxiety about, leaving the house, right? They have an agoraphobia. So, and maybe that came after some sort of trauma, right? Maybe that came after some sort of post-traumatic experience, right? So now there you have an agoraphobia response. So people might be afraid to leave the house. So what happens when someone leaves the house, right? They go out, they feel really anxious, right? They got to go grocery shopping or something. They're horribly anxious the whole time. They don't feel good. It's nerve-wracking. And then when they come home, what happens? They feel better, right? That anxiety goes away. It's negative reinforcement, right? So by avoiding the thing that you are worried about and anxious about, the thing that causes or triggers, certain unwanted thoughts or actions, that can actually be reinforcing, right? So if someone with a phobia avoids the thing that they are afraid of, right, that makes them feel better. When they run away from, the insect or something that they have a phobia of, they feel better afterwards, which only reinforces the behavior of running away. Um, so again, from the learning perspectives, we can understand how anxiety can kind of come about, right? Whether that's through traditional operant behavior or operant conditioning, classical conditioning, or even observational learning, right? A lot of times these fears are passed down from parents because the kids see the parent act afraid of something, so then they think they need to be afraid of it too. In terms of where is this in the brain, we see anxiety disorders really being dominated by the amygdala, right, which is kind of the strong emotional response center of the brain, right? It's the end of the limbic system, which has our, our what we might call our primitive or reptilian brain, right? The fight or flight responses, that's all there. And we know that there's obviously people with anxiety disorders have a larger amount of epinephrine, right? Think of the adrenaline that courses through someone's system when they're really anxious, right? So those things are linked to panic disorders, and we also see the same thing with obsessive compulsive disorder and social phobias with serotonin, right? Sometimes something like it's called an SSRI, a drug that increases serotonin absorption in the brain, that is often used to treat obsessive compulsive disorder. It can help, especially control the unwanted thoughts. So you see how like the brain and learning perspectives are all connected when we talk about these disorders. So that'll be it for this video. In the next video, we'll be talking about mood disorders, which we'll characterize with depression and bipolar disorder. So stay tuned for that. I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.